Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are putting one of humanity's biggest and maybe most personal questions on trial. We're talking about free will. We're going to put it under the microscope, look at the scientific evidence that seems to suggest that our deep-seated feeling of being in control might just be a grand illusion.
All right, so here's how this trial is going to go down. First, we'll look at the brain's mysterious head start and the famous experiment that really brought this whole thing to light. Then we'll hear the prosecution's case, this idea that our sense of control is just an illusion. But don't worry, we'll then hear the case for the defense, which pokes some serious holes in the evidence. And finally, we'll dig into what free will even means before reaching, well, an unsettled verdict.
Okay, so let's start with the indictment. This is the central piece of evidence that kicked off this whole investigation. It's a really startling discovery that suggests when it comes to your own actions, your brain gets a pretty big head start.
I know, it sounds like a silly question, right? Of course, you're in control. You decide to pick up your coffee. You decide what you're going to say next. This feeling, this sense of being the author of your own actions, is just fundamental. It's the bedrock of our entire legal system, our morality, our sense of who we are. But for decades now, neuroscience has been building a case that seriously challenges that feeling. It suggests that the conscious you might be the absolute last one to know what you're about to do.
Okay, check out this timeline, because this is the heart of the whole problem. At time 0, you do something simple, like flex your wrist. Now, you feel the conscious urge to do that about 200 milliseconds beforehand. That's less than a quarter of a second. But here's the kicker. Brain scans show that unconscious brain activity, a signal getting ready for that exact movement, actually started a full 550 milliseconds before the action. That means your brain was already gearing up to move more than a third of a second before you even felt like you made a decision.
So this buildup of electricity is the key clue. It's called the readiness potential, or RP for short. It was actually discovered way back in the 1960s. Scientists using EEG caps to measure brainwaves saw this slow electrical shift in the part of the brain that controls movement, and it always ramped up right before someone voluntarily moved. At first, it was just a cool discovery, but it very quickly became Exhibit A in the case against free will. Why? Because of that one critical detail. It always showed up before you were consciously aware of your decision.
And that brings us to the star witness for the prosecution. This is a truly groundbreaking experiment from the 1980s by a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet. He's the one who really put this mysterious timing to the test.
The way he set this up was pretty genius, really. I mean, how do you scientifically measure a subjective feeling? Well, here's what he did. He had people hooked up to an EEG to watch their readiness potential. Then he told them to look at this special fast-moving clock and just whenever they felt the urge to flex their wrist. The really crucial part was this. After they moved, they had to say exactly where the dot on the clock was when they first felt that conscious urge to move. This let Libet put 3 things on a timeline: the unconscious brain prep, the moment of conscious choice, and the action itself.
And here it is. This is the number that just sent shockwaves through science and philosophy. Libet found that, on average, the readiness potential started building up about 550 milliseconds before the action, but people only reported feeling the conscious intention about 200 milliseconds before. You do the math. That leaves a gap, a 350 millisecond gap, where the brain had already started the process, all before the person felt like they had decided anything at all.
And this is a direct quote from Benjamin Libet himself. His conclusion was totally radical. He said our conscious will doesn't kick off our actions. Nope, the brain starts the process unconsciously. Our conscious mind only finds out about it later, way too late to be the cause. The best he could offer was that maybe, just maybe, consciousness gets a tiny window to veto the action, a kind of free won't. But as for starting the action, he argued that was all brain, no conscious you involved.
So this evidence leads us right to the prosecution's main argument. If your brain is making a move before you're even aware of it, is that powerful feeling of being in control just a really, really convincing illusion?
You know, this view basically paints our conscious mind as a storyteller, or maybe like a press secretary. The brain, deep down in its unconscious machinery, makes the real call. Then, just before the action happens, our conscious mind gets the memo and quickly spins a story. Yep, I did that. That was my choice. It's like it's taking credit for a decision it had absolutely no part in making. This whole idea got a catchy name, Willusionism. A mix of will and illusion. It suggests that what we experience as a free choice is really just the last frame of a movie that was written, directed, and produced entirely by our unconscious brain. We're just sitting in the audience, watching the premiere, and thinking we were the ones behind the camera.
But hold on, this case is far from over. The evidence seems pretty bad at first glance, but now the defense gets to cross-examine these claims. And it turns out there are some pretty big holes in the case against free will.
So here's the first big objection, and it's a huge one. Is a random, meaningless wrist flick really the same thing as a major life decision? I mean, Libet's whole experiment was about these arbitrary little movements. But what about the stuff we actually care about, like choosing a career or deciding how to treat another person? Well, a fascinating study in 2019 had people make a meaningful choice. Which of two charities gets $1,000? And guess what they found? For these big, deliberate decisions, that classic readiness potential was nowhere to be found. It was completely absent. The defense also goes after the star witness itself, that readiness potential. Is that signal really a decision, or is it something else entirely? Newer theories suggest that in a task where you're just told to move whenever, your brain is basically just idling. Some scientists now think the RP isn't a decision at all, but just the random background chatter in your brain that eventually drifts past a certain point, and that tipping point triggers the action. The conscious urge we feel? That's just us noticing that it's about to tip.
To make things even more complicated for the prosecution, the defense calls a modern witness to the stand, an experiment using a technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. This thing is amazing. It uses magnetic fields to safely and temporarily mess with the activity in a specific part of the brain. It lets scientists go from just seeing a correlation to actually testing if one thing causes another.
Now, check this out. When researchers used TMS to probe our sense of agency, our feeling of being in control, they found something wild. Normally, people only felt like they weren't in control of their own actions about 11% of the time. But when they used TMS to briefly disrupt a part of the brain called the inferior parietal cortex, that feeling of not being in control shot up to 19%. This suggests that our feeling of being in charge isn't some vague story. It's actively generated by specific hardware in our brain.
Okay. So at this point in the trial, things get messy. The defense basically argues that the entire trial is based on a misunderstanding. Before we can say if free will is guilty or not, we have to ask, what do we even mean by words like self, intention, and free will?
And this is really where the science pushes us right into the deep end of philosophy. This simple question of when does a decision happen forces us to take a hard look at our most basic ideas about who we are and what it means to be the one driving our own lives.
Think about it. The entire case against free will hinges on one big assumption, that you are only the tiny little spotlight of your conscious mind. But what if that's just wrong? What if, as some philosophers argue, yourself is the whole shebang? Your conscious mind, all your unconscious stuff, your whole brain and body working together as one system. If that's true, then even if an action starts in an unconscious part of your brain, well, that's still you acting. It's just a bigger, deeper you than you might realize.
The defense raises another key objection: sloppy language. A philosopher named Alfred Mealy points out that Libet, and pretty much the whole debate that followed, just throws around words like urge, want, decision, and intention like they're all the same. But they're not, are they? An urge is just a feeling that bubbles up. A decision is a commitment. Mealy argues that the readiness potential might just be the brain signal of a rising urge, while the actual decision to go with that urge happens much, much later. Maybe right around the time we become consciously aware of it.
All right, we've heard the prosecution's case, built on that startling timeline, and we've heard the defense's rebuttal, which questioned everything from the evidence to the witnesses to the very definitions we're using. So, after all that, what's the final verdict?
The verdict is, well, the jury is still out. That simple, headline-grabbing claim that neuroscience disproves free will is honestly a massive oversimplification. The core finding from Libet's experiment, that brain activity comes first, that part holds up. But what it all means is where everyone starts arguing. It really seems to matter if we're talking about a random wrist flick or a major life choice. It really matters how you define self. And get this, psychology shows that our belief in free will has a huge impact. Studies have shown that people who are told free will is an illusion are more likely to cheat, be aggressive, and be less helpful to others. So the belief itself matters.
So in the end, the trial of free will doesn't give us that simple guilty or not guilty verdict we might have wanted. Instead, it kind of throws out the simple charge, but leaves us with a much bigger, much more profound question to think about. It challenges us to look beyond that little spotlight of our conscious mind and ask, if you are more than just your conscious thoughts, then who and what are you really?